Welcome to Philosophy Podcast. Today we're talking about Phenomenology, the Basics by Dan Zahavi. The description says Phenomenology, the Basics is a concise and engaging introduction to one of the important philosophical movements of the 20th century and to a subject that continues to grow and diversify. Yet it is also a challenging subject, the elements of which can be hard to grasp. This lucid book provides an introduction to the core ideas of phenomenology and to the arguments of its principal thinkers, Husserl, Heidegger, Merleau-Ponty, etc., written by a leading expert in the field. And we're actually talking today about the second edition, thoroughly revised and expanded. This is a 2025 edition. It contains a new chapter on critical phenomenology and updated discussions of the application of phenomenology in psychiatry, psychology, and qualitative research. Let me just read a couple of the endorsements. This is Dermot Moran. A lucid and authoritative introduction to phenomenology, including its practical applications in sociology and psychology from one of the world's leading phenomenologists. And Alessandro Duranti. Dan Zahavi, one of the most prolific and insightful phenomenologists of his generation, has provided a concise, clear, and intellectually stimulating introduction to the study of phenomenology. Dan Zahavi is professor of philosophy at the University of Copenhagen, Denmark, and director of the Center for Subjectivity Research, also in Copenhagen. Professor Zahavi, it's so great to meet you today. Welcome.
Thank you.
I told you by email that your book was actually the first edition was invaluable to me when I was first studying phenomenology. I was also taking a course with Walter Hoppe at BU. And so I was really great for me to go through this again. And I wanted to start by just reading you. So when I can, I try to write summaries after I've read something, write it kind of in my own words. And I'd like to read to you my own summary of the first two chapters here and hear what you think, what might be missing or going right or going wrong. Here's the summary of the first two chapters. I wrote, consciousness is intentional meaning it has a direction and an object. It's therefore misleading to think of consciousness as located within the mind. In a real sense, consciousness is already out there. Consciousness of the house requires contributions both from the mind and from the house. We normally speak of a house as an object in the world, but we can also speak of it with this term of art, phenomenon. The house is a phenomenon. When we say it's a phenomenon, what we're saying is that we're looking at it from this phenomenological perspective. It is both something that can manifest itself and does manifest itself to consciousness, and it's something that requires some mental structuring activity on our part when it appears. Then phenomenology would be the study of phenomena, the study of the mind to world connection, where we're considering both the mind structuring activity and the world's, I said, exhibitionism activity. So anyway, how does that sound to you?
Well, I mean, I certainly think it gets something right in highlighting to what extent phenomenology is, as I would say, simultaneously about mind and world. So I think what you are highlighting is also speaking up against certain misinterpretations of phenomenology, according to which, say, phenomenology is really about effectuating a kind of inward-looking turn such that we now start to consider, say, the subjective experiences we are undergoing with disregard for the world towards which we are directed. I mean, that would be one, I think, misinterpretation. Another misinterpretation would be to say that what phenomenology is ultimately about is really this turn towards the thing itself. I mean, back to the things themselves, as Husserl was saying. And again, for some, what that amounts to is the idea that we should try to liberate ourselves from all the kind of theoretical baggage we are carrying around in order to really pay attention to the world. And I mean, I'm not saying that both of these two perspectives are completely wrong. I mean, there is certainly something in phenomenology about paying attention to subjective experience. There's also something about really paying attention to the world. But where I think it goes wrong, and this is where I thought your way of kind of recapitulating what I had been emphasizing in the first two chapters, was this insistence on phenomenology being interested in the interface, interplay, or intertwinement between mind and world. So I think all of that I would kind of be happy about. I guess there are a few things perhaps where one could be a little bit more careful. So I mean, you talked about us having to avoid the idea that consciousness is inside the mind. But of course, that raises the question of what is the relationship between mind and consciousness. So I think perhaps it would be,
good point.
yeah. I mean, it might be better to say, consciousness is not inside the head, or it's not inside the brain, because I think mind and consciousness are more or less terms for one and the same thing.
That's a very good point, right?
So that was one thing. The other thing was this idea about I think this is actually something that comes up in your next question. So let me leave it for that. But I think also I think you're quite right in saying that thinking about the world as a phenomenon. I mean, because this also has to do with this change of attitude that phenomenology is all about. I mean, it's about looking at the world in a different way than we usually do. In our ordinary, natural, pre-philosophical life, we kind of just take the world for ready-made. And I mean, I kind of were using this example to some of my students recently. I mean, when they come into the classroom, they probably don't think a lot about all the utensils in that classroom, of course, being products of a very complicated process of manufacturing. I mean, the blackboard, the chairs, the tables, they're just there, and they don't think about the fact that, of course, they weren't just there from the outset. I mean, they are precisely fabricated. And I guess what phenomenology to some extent wants us to reflect upon is the fact that the world we live in, the world of experience, is also in all kinds of ways structured by our cognitive and affective life. I mean, it's not just there, it's precisely a world of experience that is correlated to different types of intentionality. That's, I think, is for me the main insights of phenomenology.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I see that. I think the way I can see how that helps what I wrote. Let's talk about intentionality. Mm-hmm. So I was or aboutness. I've heard it is one of the ways you can think of intentionality. So I guess one of the things, maybe we start with consciousness. I think, I think you could also say awareness. Another place we could start is perception. I'm wondering if there is a hierarchy where you have lots of complex types of intentionality, but there's this consciousness or perception which are always there, and then layered on top of them are more complex things like recollection, imagination, emotions, and so forth. Is that the way you look at it?
Well, I think it's a little bit complicated because, and I guess the complication emerged the moment you started talking about emotions as something on top of something else. Because I guess, it's one thing to say a recollection. I mean, if I'm recollecting what I had for breakfast this morning, it seems to make good sense to suggest that recollection is to some extent, derivative compared to the perception I was enjoying when I actually had the breakfast. And had I not had the perception of the breakfast, I couldn't subsequently recollect that previous experience. Likewise, likewise, for instance, when it comes to the question of abstract theorizing, one of the things that both Husserl and also Merleau-Ponty wanted to emphasize was precisely what they called the primacy of perception. They wanted to argue that our initial, most fundamental relationship to the world, rather than being one of abstract, detached theorizing, is precisely one of embodied perceptual engagement. And so this, of course, again, flows into this whole debate about the relationship between the life world and the world of science, which might be a question we will return to. So there is this idea of perception having a certain primacy. And I guess one model or one example I often refer to when trying to explain this idea is basically thinking about a comparison. I mean, I can think about the Eiffel Tower when it's not around. I mean, when I'm currently located in Copenhagen. Obviously, the Eiffel Tower is not in Copenhagen; it's in Paris. I can still have thoughts about the Eiffel Tower. Now, when I do have thoughts about the Eiffel Tower is my intentional object. But the obvious question to ask, or one obvious question to ask, would be: might there be ways of intentionally relating to the Eiffel Tower that is more optimal, epistemically more optimal, that is more original, primary, has a different kind of primacy and immediacy than simply thinking about the Eiffel Tower in its physical absence? And again, the question or the answer to that question would be, well, when I'm perceiving the Eiffel Tower, I'm confronted with the Eiffel Tower itself in its bodily presence. There's a certain fullness to that experience which is lacking when we are talking about mere thought. So in that sense, I mean, again, I think Husserl and Merleau-Ponty would talk about perception having this kind of also epistemic primacy. But where you kind of got me a little bit off track was when you threw in the issue of emotion. Because, of course, there is a question here about whether our initial relationship to the world is somehow neutral. I mean, and is emotions, values, is that something that only comes in later on? Or is it rather the case that from the outset, our relationship to the world is always, if you will, they're always, it's always saturated with a specific valence.
Yes.
And I mean, there are certainly phenomenologists who have argued like that and who have said, I mean, the idea that our relationship to the world should be this kind of neutral, detached relationship is really a kind of aberration. I mean, we are from the outset pulled in by the world and we react emotionally to what the world shows up as.
That's such a profound point. I appreciate you raising that. I guess when trying to explain it, you start off with this antiseptic case. Not one does, not you, but anyone would, I think, start with, okay, let's look at a house. But that's a really good point. That's not to say it may be for teaching, it may be primary, but it's not primary in life necessarily.
Well, I mean, I also, there's a funny example that Husserl once mentions where there's this question of, when are we satisfied that we are somehow, I mean, when is it enough? I mean, and you might say, I might perceive the house and I might think, well, having seen it, that's the house itself. I might also be an engineer and I might say, well, if I really want to know the house, it's not enough just to look at it. I have to measure it. I have to measure its stability. I mean, I'm not an engineer. I don't know what
right.
are doing, but I presumably they have different interests than me as, say, the buyer of a house or me as the inhabitant in a house. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that what counts as enough is, of course, also partly dependent upon our interests. And those interests, again, are typically not without valence. I mean, they are also driven by again, specific things that we care about? And again, how can we talk about stuff that we care about and value without once more bringing in emotions? So, I mean, even when you were saying in a teaching situation, again, I mean, presumably the students chose to attend class because there were certain things that they were caring about. So again, I think even for the students, I'm sure there are all kinds of emotions at
That's
play.
such a good point. Yeah. You do think so, just in terms of this concept of intentionality, it would apply to emotions. They're about things. Some of the other ones I wanted to throw out there were desire, love, hate, analyze, investigate. All of these things have aboutness to them. Intentionality. Do you agree?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Again, very, very. I guess one thing that is important to get clear when talking about intentionality to people who are not familiar with phenomenology is to make it clear from the outset that what is meant by intentionality is not what is occasionally meant by the term in ordinary kind of conversations, where it has something to do with me voluntarily deciding to do something. I mean, so I intentionally shot the man, for instance. I mean, it's not that notion. I mean, that would be just one example of what phenomenologists are referring to when they're talking about intentionality, because what they primarily have in mind is precisely the offness or aboutness of consciousness. The fact that consciousness is not just dwelling in itself, but always transcending itself, targeting or being preoccupied with other things. And then, of course, one can exemplify that in all kinds of ways. I mean, I can desire things, I can love things, I can judge things, I can perceive them, anticipate them, remember them, and so on and so forth. So I guess the question is rather, I mean, I think the question that then eventually comes up is, well, might there be exceptions? I mean, might there be states of experiential states that are not intentional? I mean, I guess that's the interesting question. And here there seems to be some disagreement between the phenomenologists, and ultimately this might also point us towards making certain distinctions between different, more fundamental differences between types of intentionality. So first of all, Husserl, contrary to what is often assumed, initially did not claim that all experiences are intentional. I mean, this was the view of Brentano, but it was actually not Husserl's view. And I mean, the examples that Husserl mentions for exceptions to this general idea that consciousness is always conscious of something would, for instance, be something like an itch or nausea. I mean, if you are nauseous, you are certainly feeling something, but it's not clear that that nausea has a specific object. Likewise, with an itch. So there might be some exceptions. Now, some more interesting exceptions that play a lesser role in Husserl, but has a more gets more attention in Heidegger, for instance, would be the existence of certain moods. So think about. I mean, one I think classical example is the distinction between fear and anxiety.
Right.
Where the claim would be I can fear a wolf, but anxiety is not object directed in that sense. It's a much more kind of general atmosphere of not feeling at home or everything is somehow being uncanny. So it's not targeting a specific object. And then one could ask, does that mean that anxiety is not intentional? Or what about depression? I mean, typically, if you're depressed, again, it's a kind of global state you are in. It's not as if you are depressed. I mean, one might be depressed about stuff at the moment, but that's perhaps a slightly inaccurate way of talking or using the term depression. So there might be certain general states of mind that somehow color or pervade or characterize our entire encounter with the world rather than picking out specific objects. And the question would then be, do these moods, as they are sometimes called, I mean, do they exemplify non-intentional states? That is one option. The other option would be to say, well, perhaps they are intentional, but they are just intentional in a different way. They are not instances of kind of narrow object intentionality, but they are intentional in the sense that they have something to do with our encounter with the world. So they still bring us outside ourselves. They still characterize our encounter with what is different from ourselves, even if they don't take specific objects. So again, these are some of the discussions that have been going on in phenomenology over the years.
It's fascinating. I was thinking this morning about another example, and I think you might touch on this in chapter 6 when you talk about Merleau-Ponty talking about a certain irreducible consciousness. I was just thinking that when you go from one concern to another, there's kind of a gap in there where I can think to myself that I'm going to stop what I'm thinking. Right now, I'm just being. I don't really have any focus, and I think that there's this sense that, yeah, even to the extent that I'm not focused on anything at a particular time, there's always this background, just there-ness that is prior to any specific intentionality. Does that make sense to you?
Well, I guess one question to ask would be, when you say there-ness, I mean, do you then mean there-ness inside me, or do you mean there-ness in the world?
In the world.
Because again, I mean, I think
I see what you mean. Even then,
because even if it's in the world, I would say, well, that is still,
gotcha.
Well, I mean, of course, this is partly what Heidegger would talk about when he was talking about Dasein, being in the world. And he would say, well, that is the most basic form of intentional relatedness. So personally, I would not take that to be a kind of objection to what the phenomenologists are trying to stress. Because for me, again, what they are trying to stress is this idea that we cannot understand the nature of consciousness if we just look at it in isolation or separation from the world in which it is present. I mean,
so what was Merleau-Ponty speaking of about something irreducible in the phenomenology of perception? I think it was about act. He said it was about act intentionality versus operative intentionality, and that part of that was irreducible. We could only point to it.
Yeah, well, so I think that this distinction that Merleau-Ponty makes is partly, I think, he's basically drawing on Husserl there as well. And I think act intentionality is basically another term for what I called object intentionality,
right.
And operative intentionality, or Husserl uses the term fungierende Intentionalität, is a more passive. I mean, so again, I mean, part of Husserl's kind of work is precisely devoted to this taxonomy of different intentional states, and he's not just interested kind of in a horizontal, differentiation. He's also interested in a more kind of, if you will, vertical differentiation, where some are not just more cognitively complicated than others, but it's also such that some forms of intentionality are more explicit, are more characterized by full attention versus more forms of intentionality that more happens in the shadow, if you will. And of course, I mean, this partly points towards the question of whether phenomenology could accommodate something along the line of the unconscious. I mean, obviously, because I think what Husserl sometimes talks about is when talking about this operative intentionality. I think one example he gives of that is instinctual forms of instinctual intentionality, the intentionality of drives. And there are places where he himself says that, well, this could be viewed as a certain contribution to a phenomenology of the unconscious. And of course, this raises a huge question about whether what phenomenologists are talking about when they're talking about the unconscious,
Sure.
I mean, what that might have to do with what psychoanalysis is.
Repressed thoughts and all that, right? Yeah. Let's talk then about whether there are non-mental things that could be said to be intentional. So I was thinking of a novel we could say is about something. I was thinking this morning, another thing we could say is a country's flag. People would say that's about something. Is that something that you would use the word intentional for? Can something non-mental be intentional?
Yeah, but I think that Husserl's clear view here would be that if you talk about intentionality here, it's basically derived. I mean, it's not intrinsic. It's not as if a flag, by virtue of its own properties, refers to anything. I mean, this is all, of course, a question of a certain cultural practice. It's only because certain people view the flag as having those meanings that it refers to those things. And similarly, with a book, I mean, there are no intrinsic connection between the letters and the words and what they refer to. It's only because we interpret them in the way we do that they have the meaning in question. And so I think very importantly, I mean, Husserl would say, and I think there are some links here to also what Searle would later argue.
Searle.
Yes, John Searle.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, this the difference between non-derived and derived intentionality, where I mean, some things are about other things because we interpret them in a specific way. But when it comes to consciousness, its intentionality is intrinsic. So it's not the case that my thoughts are about the books on the shelves that I'm currently looking at. It's not the case that my thoughts about those books because you interpret me as having thoughts of that kind. No, they have that reference in virtue of their own nature. So I think that would be very fundamental. And of course, this is in contrast to certain other views. I mean, where the reason why you might be said to possess intentionalities because I adopt a certain attitude towards you, interpreting you in that manner, which I think would be probably more along what Dennett would have claimed.
Daniel Dennett.
Yeah. So again, I just think, I mean, I think it's important to realize that for the phenomenologists, I mean, intentionality is really an intrinsic feature of consciousness, something that consciousness possesses in virtue of its own nature. It's not due to some subsequent secondary interpretation of consciousness, whereas whatever intentionality we want to attribute to, say, written statements or symbols or signs or pictures is one that involves and draws upon our intentional capacities.
I understand that. That's very helpful. Thank you. So I think, but reading your book and taking Walter Hopp's class, there were two really, I think, profound things for me. One was this idea of being out there already, consciousness or Dasein being out there already. And the other was this concept of the life world. I wrote a little summary of why it was kind of mind-blowing for me. I wrote, the insight is that it is not the case that clock time, the Cartesian grid, naps, and natural science are the real world, and our life world is an unfortunate distortion. The life world is actually prior, but the important thing is that it is valid, worthy of study. It's not inferior. It's not a distortion of this other real world. I thought that was, anyway, that to me was a very profound point. I maybe you could. I didn't really explain what the life world is. Maybe you could explain that to the listeners,
Yeah, no,
and what you think about what I said, also, please.
yeah, no, no. I mean, I would agree. So again, I mean, life world. Well, I mean, to some extent, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, the life world is the world we live in. It's the world we inhabit, the world we care about, the world we are familiar with. And what kind of world is that? Well, it's not a world of particle physics or brain circuits. It's a world composed of pretty ordinary objects. Table, chairs, flowers, other people. So it's very much a world structured and pervaded by human meaning. It's a world also structured in accordance with our own bodily dimensions and skills. So in the life world, I mean, I see certain things as affording certain actions. Glass, I see not as a kind of, not simply as a hollow object. I mean, rather I see a glass as something that affords picking up and drinking from. Well, so that's the life world, of course. And the question is, what is its validity? What is its reality? And I think that it is very much being challenged these days. I mean, there's a challenge coming from physics, from the natural sciences, claiming, and this is an old idea, that ultimately, I mean, all these objects are not really real in any fundamental sense. There's a famous text by Eddington dating back from 1927, where Eddington talks about two tables. There's a table we are familiar with from ordinary experience, the table that is solid, colored, etc. And then there's the table described by physics that basically consists of particles, swirling around in a void. And then he says what physics tells us is that only that latter table is real. So that's of course a way of basically, invalidating and destroying. I mean, the whole world we take for granted in ordinary life. So that's an important challenge, and another challenge is coming from contemporary neuroscience that basically argues, according to a fairly widespread view, that the world of experience is ultimately a kind of brain-generated illusion. Yeah. I mean, so I mean, when presented with those two views, one might say, well, what the phenomenologists are offering is, of course, a completely different setup, because what phenomenologists would say, I mean, this is a complicated story, because there's a lot to be said here, but one idea of the phenomenologists would be to say that the practice of neuroscience and the practice of physics are actually undermining the very claims that the physicists and the neuroscientists are making, because they could not do what they are doing were they not constantly referring to and appealing to and drawing on the very life world that they are at the same time claiming doesn't exist. Because you can't do physics without, reading, without employing instruments that you perceive. You can't conduct science without, discussing and interpreting the findings with other people. So, I mean, if all of that is somehow not really existent, well, how are you supposed to somehow even be able to establish and justify your own theories? So again, I mean, when Husserl introduced, I mean, he was not the first to use the term life world, but he was the first to kind of really offer a systematic analysis of it. And part of what he wanted to do was precisely to offer an alternative to the world that science were describing a world that he thought were increasingly losing contact with human experience, and for Husserl, this led to a kind of alienation between, or a schism between science and ordinary life that he found very catastrophic. And part of the idea of introducing the life world was to try to mend this gap or bridge between, again, ordinary life and
Yeah.
the life of science. Yeah.
I appreciate that you, in the second edition, you brought the biographies in the introduction, kind of out of the footnotes into the text, and you added in Stein and Scheler. I just, it's difficult to think about Husserl, the crisis. I just keep thinking about what he was going through at the time that he wrote that, with not only being stripped of the professorship because of his Jewish ancestry, but also the betrayal by Heidegger, arguably, and just how he did this. I would just imagine I would just crawl up in a little hole. How he went out and wrote this book. If you look at the people you have listed, the dramatis personae, these are some just incredible people. I mean, it's amazing. Sartre, in 1960, you don't even mention this, but you mentioned nothing, but the people marching through the streets saying, "Kill Sartre." Heidegger, of course, Edith Stein, born Jewish and a Catholic saint. I don't know. It's the story of phenomenology. The people is also makes this such an exciting field, I think.
They were all colorful. I mean, I guess.
Yeah, colorful.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah.
So when we talk about the life world, you say the life world is a historically and culturally shaped world, a world that constitutes the familiar horizon of meaning we as bodily subjects are anchored in and socialized into. I guess, starting from the beginning, when you're thinking about the house, when I think about trying to study the life world, then I'm thinking, okay, one is now going to be using the standard sorts of research that you think of, like we're going to be reading memoir, we're going to be reading about, we're going to be reading primary documents for what is going on at this time. We're going to try to build up build up the history and the culturally shaped world. It's not something we can find in our structuring activity, in our mental structuring activity. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not entirely sure, because I mean, I guess it depends on exactly what you have in mind. I mean, what I would want to say is definitely that culture and history, I mean, there's an experiential dimension to that. It's not just some kind of abstract artifact. And I think it's very easy to point to everyday experiences that are in all kinds of ways shaped by both history and culture. I mean, very, very simply put, I mean, I might read the newspaper and get emotionally upset about certain events happening, I don't know, to either compatriots of mine, or were I religious, to people belonging to my faith. I mean, how are you supposed to explain the structure of that emotional reaction without appealing to certain cultural components?
Right.
And likewise, I mean, to take an example of Husserl that he brings in Ideas too. I mean, Husserl says, there's a certain way in which one uses fork and knife. And of course, the reference to the one here is what Heidegger would later refer to as das Mann. I mean, so there's a certain way in which one, that is our cultural group, are doing things, and if you don't do things in that way, I mean, you might be behaving inappropriately. There might be normative repercussions. So I think there's all kinds of ways in which even the most mundane of our activities are influenced by cultural, norms and expectations and traditions. And I think this is partly what the phenomenologists are pointing to. So again, I think it's very important that the life world of which they are speaking is, of course, not a private world. It's not a solitary world. It's a world that is socially structured through and through. I mean, so again, I mean, we here take certain things for granted that you in the United States are not taken for granted, and depending on what is being taken for granted, I mean, the world also shows up in different ways. I mean, again, I think one can exemplify that in so many different manners. So I think again, I guess all I just wanted to point out was that the reference to historicity and tradition and culture and customs is very much one that is also experientially salient. I mean, it's not as if experience is only about the individual, and then there are all the other things that are somehow, I don't know, theoretical entities or something like that.
That's very helpful. Thank you. In chapter 8, we move to inner subjectivity and what's the title here? Intersubjectivity and sociality. And I when I read that, I think there's going to be, I talked about the 2 Gestalt shifts I had. I think there's supposed to be here a third, which is that we're going to find a new way of thinking about intersubjectivity. It's going to be something like our interactions with others are more direct and unmediated than we typically assume. That one I didn't, if that's going to be a good Gestalt shift, that one I didn't find. And I thought from your description that it seemed like there's a disagreement. I thought maybe Sartre did find something there, Heidegger not. And is that is that fair to say?
Well, yeah. Well, I don't. I'm not sure that the Heideggerians would be happy about that presentation. I don't think it's totally fair vis-a-vis Heidegger. But I guess perhaps I mean, let's just take one step back and try to determine, what exactly is, I don't know, the problem of intersubjectivity, or what is it at all referring to? And I mean, one of the problems is, so to speak, the problem of other minds. I mean, how can we ever get to know that there are others? I mean, how can we ever escape some kind of solipsism? And the phenomenologists certainly have something to say on that specific topic. And I mean, it basically comes out primarily in a discussion of empathy. For instance, it comes out in a discussion of to what extent our engagement with others does not take the form of me making all kinds of abductive inferences in order to be in a better position to explain and predict the behavior of the physical body that I'm currently looking at.
Totally.
It would rather say would be, I mean, this is not a correct description of human interaction. There is a much more immediate, much more low-level way of understanding the embodied minds of others in their action and expressivity. So that's all, one line. And I guess to some extent one could say, well, that has something to do with this issue of our understanding of others being more immediate than certain other theories might claim.
Okay.
But I think this is only part of the topic, because I mean, another way of looking at it would be on the one hand emphasizing, as I already said, the extent to which the life world is precisely not a private world but a social world from the outset. So the idea would be, well, in order to understand our being in the world, it's not as if, well, we can more or less describe that exhaustively, and then as one of the very last building blocks, we will then add sociality on the top. No, on the contrary, we need somehow sociality from very fundamental onwards. I mean, so that would be one way of bringing in sociality. And then, of course, I mean, what you find in Husserl is also this idea that if we want to understand the nature of objectivity, if we want to understand the nature of objective validity, we also need to bring in intersubjectivity, because objectivity for Husserl is not about how things are independently of us in some hidden behind the scenes world. That's not what objectivity is. Objectivity is precisely that which is valid for all of us. I mean, and so, in order to kind of make sense out of that very notion, Husserl wants to discuss, how do we reach, how do we communicate, how do we reach agreement about certain matters, and that's basically the way he tries to understand this notion of objectivity. So again, I think that the phenomenological focus on intersubjectivity, it goes beyond just paying attention to or trying to understand what is called other experience of friend after one. It has other components to it.
Okay, that's good, helpful. Thank you. I see that. So the book has, as I would describe it, part one is the principles of philosophical phenomenology. Part two is some concrete applications of philosophical phenomenology. And then the third part is applications, meaning we're leaving philosophy now and looking at how phenomenology is applied in other fields. And psychology, as you point out, would be the first and obvious one. And I wanted to just take a second and ask you about, I have been seeing your name a lot in work on schizophrenia. I wondered if you could just speak to that a little bit. It seems that you've been working with physicians and scientists on that. Can you say a bit about that work?
No, of course. So I have worked with psychiatrists for 30 years now, and I think there's a specific. Well, it's not completely coincidental, because, and I think this historically is of great interest. Psychiatry was one of the very first disciplines outside of philosophy that started paying attention to phenomenology. And very early on, psychiatrists were intrigued by what phenomenology had to offer. And so there is actually a kind of phenomenological tradition within psychiatry. And I was then very lucky in meeting. I was in the lucky position that one of the kind of foremost representatives of phenomenological psychiatry happened to be in Copenhagen as well. So that was, of course, very fortunate for both of us, and we then started.
Who is that?
So that's Joseph Parnasse.
Oh, yeah.
So we have been collaborating for many years, and I guess the relevant question is, well, why was it that the psychiatrists back then started being interested in phenomenology? And I don't think the answer should be so surprising. The idea would be, well, that psychiatry and mental illnesses, that if we want to understand these illnesses or these mental disorders, it's very important to kind of get the experiential perspective into play. And of course, this is in contrast. And the phenomenological psychiatrists have always, been in a certain opposition to a certain kind of reductive biological psychiatry, where they claim to be, if we want to understand what is wrong here, and this is a little bit of a caricature, or formulating it fairly extremely, but the claim would be, okay, mental disorders is about a broken brain. If we want to understand what is the fault here, we need to figure out what are the malfunctioning brain mechanisms. We shouldn't talk with the patient, because that will just give us all kind of crazy eruptions that doesn't really point back to the underlying mechanisms. So that would be a very different kind of, objectifying third personal perspective on the patient, whereas the phenomenological psychiatrist, and again, I'm simplifying a lot here, but the phenomenological psychiatrist would say, well, whatever might ultimately be the neuronal, underlying mechanisms, there's a whole stratum here of experience that needs to be analyzed and explored in order to understand, the the way the patient, him or herself, is coping with this changed life situation than he or she is living in, because only by understanding his or her perspective on this will we be able to offer a proper care. So we can't just, push the patient to the side and just go and look at the underlying brain, because that will not provide us with the means of offering proper care. And the idea was then that, well, if we look at some of these mental disorders, and it has primarily been schizophrenia that I have been working on together with Panas, that if we look at that, well, there are certain very fundamental changes occurring in the fundamental structures of intentionality. It's the very being in the world that are somehow differently construed in the patient with schizophrenia, and here, analysis offered by phenomenology could provide the psychiatrist with certain tools that would allow psychiatrists to get a better grip on how exactly the patient were existing under these circumstances.
And also,
this has all been part of the exploration. And one specific concept that has then popped up is that there is a certain interest in a specific notion of selfhood that seems to have been that seems to be fragile or unstable in the case of schizophrenia. And perhaps the easiest ways to exemplify what is meant by this is this very well-known phenomenon of thought insertion. I mean, that a patient with schizophrenia can complain about him or her undergoing certain experiences that are not experienced as his or her own. And so the patient would then say,
someone put these thoughts in my head. Yeah.
Precisely. And so how should we understand that? And it seems to point to a certain, again, transformation of self-consciousness, or a certain transformation of the very sense of self. And again, here ideas from phenomenology have proven useful.
And maybe also I think there's a book by Moeller I saw, which just talks about trying to predict find early on in prodromal stage who might be susceptible to this based on what's happening to internal experience.
Yes.
That's just fascinating work. The book is Phenomenology, the Basics, 2025 second edition. Thank you so much, Professor Zahavi. It was great to meet you and talk to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for doing this for the profession. Yeah.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Very good to see you.
See you.
Bye-bye.